Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this session, Pandemics and Other Dangers Across Borders, U.S. Foreign Policy in Crisis. My name is Tim Morrison. I'm a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute. Periodically, you may hear my first grade 6-year-old son chiming in with helpful comments as he remote schools. Another happy point of this pandemic and its own unique danger. But I'll try to control him a little bit here. Again, my name is Tim Morrison. I'm a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute. I joined Hudson this past January after 18 months at the National Security Council and after several years on Capitol Hill. Before that, in a variety of positions, including the House Armed Services Committee. I'm pleased to be joined by good friends, colleagues, mentors, teachers, in many cases. First, Mark Dubowitz, who many of you know. I listened into his session yesterday with H.R. McMaster. With a true pleasure. Mark is the CEO of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. He is a former venture capitalist and technology executive. He founded FDD's Iran program and co-founded FDD's Center on Economic and Financial Power, and the Center on Military Political Power and its China program. He's an expert on Iran's nuclear program and global threat network and contributes to FDD's China program. I would just like to point out, for my own purposes, when I was working at the White House, Mark was a frequent go-to for questions and expertise. And when his bio speaks to his advice to the Bush, Obama, and Trump administrations, to lawmakers, testimony before Congress, I can just speak to that firsthand. Also, I can testify firsthand to Danny Pletka's expertise. She is a senior fellow in foreign and defense policy studies at AEI, the American Enterprise Institute. She teaches at Middle East policy at Georgetown University's Walsh School of Foreign Service. She was previously senior vice president for foreign and defense policy studies at AEI. And before that was a senior professional staff member for the Middle East and South Asia for the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations. Danny taught me so many of the things that I know, and that's either a good thing or a bad thing. But I have, yes, exactly. Results speak for themselves, I guess. But I'm pleased to be here for this panel with Mark and Danny. Mark and Danny are talents on foreign policy. They're talents who understand that policy is made at both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue. All too often, scholars and experts look chiefly at the executive branch and overlook Capitol Hill and its role in steering foreign and defense policy. Not so with Danny and Mark. They know how to get things done at both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue, and so I'm happy to be here with them and to kick off on this really important topic. We're at a unique moment in American history, America's role in the world. And to kick off the conversation, maybe just a framing conversation, and then get into some more interesting questions. Why should Americans care with everything that's going on in the world, with the pandemic, with the economic dislocation? We have an election coming up. Why should Americans care about foreign policy, defense policy? Why should national security be at the top of their list of things that they get up and they worry about, given everything else that's going on? And so, Mark, I'll just turn it over to you, and Danny, as I know you very well, you'll be happy to jump in with your own views. But why don't we try to help our friends on the channel here understand a little bit more why we think Americans should care about these issues, given everything else that's on their minds right now.
Great, Tim. Well, listen, thanks so much for the warm introduction, and wonderful to be on a panel with you and with Danny as well, both close friends and mentors as well to me. So it's really wonderful to be here, and thanks to the Philanthropy Roundtable for having me. So look, why do we care about foreign policy? Because foreign policy cares about us. and sometimes in very negative ways. We think ourselves fortunate as Americans, living on this huge continent surrounded by oceans, and that we're not affected by foreign policy. I think we've learned over and over again that's just not the case, and certainly 9/11 brought that home to our generation. And if we don't care about foreign policy, I can tell you who really does care about foreign policy, and that's the Chinese Communist Party, the mullahs in Iran, the Vladimir Putin in Moscow, the Kim family in Pyongyang. They care deeply about foreign policy. They care deeply about replacing American leadership with their own. And obviously they have values and interests that are inimical to ours as Americans. Particularly, they don't share our views of freedom and of democracy and of the kind of prosperity that really America has brought to the world. We should also care about we should also care about foreign policy, because if America stops caring about foreign policy, we can't pass that mantle of leadership to another country or another power that shares our interests. When the British Empire effectively collapsed after World War II, exhausted after fighting the Nazis, they passed the mantle of leadership to the United States, and we took it on, and we did quite well despite various setbacks over the years. We won the Cold War, brought down the Soviet Union, and we established prosperity and liberty around the globe. And if the United States goes away, if Americans don't care about foreign policy, if we retreat inward to care only about domestic policy, then we have no one who will take on that baton, except, as I mentioned, some of the worst leaders and authoritarian regimes in the world. So we need to care about foreign policy, or foreign policy will come back to bite us.
Danny, please.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks, Mark. And thanks to all of you at the Philanthropy Roundtable. I'm really happy to be part of this. I think that people think that when you ask a question like, why should we care about foreign policy, it's sort of a softball, opportunity to talk about whatever we want to talk about. And that fails to appreciate just what a problem we have on our hands. As Mark said, it's not just that foreigners care about us. It is that we are at a period, I think, in the United States, facing a generation that is now old enough to vote and growing older, and an important part of our political and social and economic landscape. And they don't know what existed, not just before 9/11, they don't know what existed before the end of the Cold War. And they don't appreciate what a world America built. They think this is the world as it is, and that when America plays a role in it, that is a pernicious role. That when we are abroad, it is not to deliver good things. It's not to set the standards of Bretton Woods. It's not to build the United Nations. It's not to win not just the Cold War, but World War II. It's not just to stand for freedom. It is, it is basically to do bad things, to invade countries, lop out leaders, and otherwise interfere in ways that are culturally and politically inappropriate. And the more we pat ourselves on the back that foreign policy isn't something that needs to be talked about, the less they know. And the less they know, the less they want to do. And if you look at polling, what you see is that the constituency for America and a leadership role in the world has diminished in ways that I think are unprecedented. I teach a Middle East class at Georgetown, and for the first time last year, I had a young lady raise her hand and tell me that she didn't think the United States should be involved in the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. Not because it wasn't important, because she recognized it was important. She was studying the Middle East, but because she thought we could actually do no good in the world. And I asked the rest of the class, I asked them to raise their hands, whether they agreed. And the whole class agreed. I mean, I don't think people appreciate what's out there. I really don't. And the further point, and sort of, to answer the question more specifically, is that, it's not just that foreign policy cares about us. The Chinese Communist Party has ambitions that are antithetical to our national security, that Putin obviously has interests that are antithetical to our national security. It is that there are things like the coronavirus. And when there are governments like the Communist Party in China, they cover up what it is and cause it to spread without us knowing about it. When there are things like the Communist Party in China and there's a coronavirus and they are a dominating power in the World Health Organization, the World Health Organization goes along with them when they say, no, don't tell anybody, it's all cool. So we could go on and on and on in this vein about the kind of transnational threats there are when we don't care about foreign policy, that affect people's lives, that affect people's voting, and that aren't just about what the media believes to be Donald Trump. But this is a huge challenge for us. And I would say that the educational challenge for us is absolutely enormous.
So as I mentioned, I'm the father of a 6-year-old. He's studying across the room here. He's on his iPad. Let's talk a little bit about the education for a minute, because I think it speaks to the question of what is America's role in the world, and as the center right, which I think we would all claim to be. There's a question about what do we stand for anymore? What is our vision for how America should come out of the pandemic? What role should America have with international institutions? Mark, FDD, has been doing great work, and Danny, you have as well on America's role with international organizations, China's plan for international organizations. As a center right movement, what do we argue America's role post pandemic should be, and how does that compare to some of the other theories that are out there? We've got the center left, we've got the progressive movement, we've got this restrainer, retreat, disengagement thesis on the right. What is our vision?
Well, look, Tim, I think our vision has got to be to do battle with the isolationists on both the right and left. I consider myself sort of a political centrist. I didn't grow up in America. I'm a proud immigrant to the United States. I was born in South Africa, grew up in Canada, came here almost 20 years ago. Adore this country. Just think it is not only just indispensable in foreign policy, but it also reflects the kind of values that I want to bring my children up with. And there's nowhere else in the world that can offer that kind of opportunity. So I get really, really sad and really angry to see the self-flagellation in this country, and it's kind of the generation that Danny's talking about. I'm terrified to send my son to college in a few years because I know what he's going to be taught, and I worry that is the trajectory. And then we have this, these isolationist wings in both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, and we have this fight, as you say, between the restrainers and the retainers, right? Those who want to restrain American power, who want to bring American troops home, who don't believe that American power has been good for the world in any way, as Danny alluded to, and the retainers who understand that without a American presence around the world, that ultimately our enemies are not going to be just satisfied with dominating key areas of the world, but they're going to ultimately, those threats are going to come home. And again, I'm of the 9/11 generation. But as Danny said, many of the people that are growing up, many of the people taking positions of influence now, culturally, politically, economically, are people that were not even born after 9/11 and have no sense of 9/11 and believe, in fact, that the war on terrorism was a failure. Whereas I remember that day, you remember that day. We were all waiting for the other shoe to drop. We thought that the 9/11 attack was just the beginning. We were waiting for a possibility of an attack using weapons of mass destruction. And the fact that for almost 20 years, there hasn't been a major mass casualty attack on American soil from jihadists is a huge success. for which our military and our national security establishment, and yes, both Democrats and Republicans, deserve enormous credit. Because it wasn't clear that day or in the weeks and months that followed that we wouldn't be hit again. But the perception on both the isolationist right and the isolationist left is that the war on terrorism has been a huge failure. So how do we educate a new generation about the success that we had and also about the tremendous courage that the American military and the American security establishment demonstrated over the past 19 years in making sure that we were all kept safe?
So before turning to Danny, let me just hone in a little bit more here. There is this tug of war between traditional center-right engagement and this new retreat and disengagement camp, the Quincy Institutes, and these new centers that are popping up at places like the Atlantic Council that are trying to make this isolationism, this old school isolationism, fashionable with new terms like ending forever wars. On the topic of this panel, pandemics, why does it matter which vision predominates in, for example, the Republican Party, in the center-right community? Why does it matter if the plan to move on when the pandemic is brought under control, when there's a vaccine? Why does it matter if that's a traditional pro-engagement center-right plan and policy, or a restraint/retreat/disengagement policy that charts the path forward out of the pandemic? Mark.
Look, Tim, I think this is, I know you try to frame this as sort of a center-right issue, but I think this is a bipartisan problem because I think both on the center-right and the center-left, effectively the sane center, the internationalist center, the center that believes in American engagement and American presence around the world, that believes in American values and believes in the story that we're telling, which I think is a true story, that the United States has shown tremendous leadership, in some respects, tremendous beneficence in establishing a world order that has brought prosperity and security and peace to hundreds of millions of people. That is under assault by the isolationist right and the isolationist left. I worry as much about the Quincy Institute as I do about Tucker Carlson on Fox News, right? Who really is championing that isolationist right that I believe has infected not insignificant areas of the Republican Party. I think it's going to be very interesting to see if Biden is elected, if some of the internationalists around Biden are strong enough to resist the tremendous energy and political force that's coming from the far left, and whether he can steer a moderate internationalist path over 4 years. I worry tremendously. I know Danny worries about that as well. She's written about this very eloquently. So it matters. It matters not only that we chart a centrist internationalist pathway on the right, and we resist these isolationists who I think have infected the Republican Party, but it matters a lot what Biden and moderate Democrats, if Biden is still a moderate Democrat, I hope he is for the sake of the nation, do in standing up against the radical left and the isolationists in their party. It matters tremendously. I think a huge amount is at stake. And in the wake of pandemics, we only have to look at what happened after World War I and the pandemic of the 1917, 1918 to see what came in its wake, right? The rise of fascism, the rise of isolationism, an unwillingness of the liberal democracies to take on the growing fascism in Europe and in Asia. And of course, we all know that the tragedies that ensued.
Danny.
So, I mean, look, this is, we're all preaching to the choir here. I think there's a lot of agreement among us about the challenges that we face. And there is an unhappy alliance that I think all of us have talked about over the last few years between the extremist left and the extremist right, the disengagers, the isolationists. They don't like to be called isolationists, but Mark, you're exactly right. They couch it in the ending the forever wars. The problem for us is that I think a lot of us, if I speak about not just the center right, but the center right and the center left, aren't really in the fight as much as we could be, because there's not a lot of space for us. And that's the reality. I'll encapsulate it for you in one moment. During the Democratic presidential primaries, when Joe Biden was up against Warren and Sanders and the whole clown car full of candidates, and he got the living daylights kicked out of him by his fellow Democrats because he was a guy who said that he was able to work across the aisle. And he said, well, I know Mitch McConnell and I used to work with, and everybody said, that he was attacked from the left. And the very notion that somehow, working with people who are like-minded to defeat bad ideas is really a disease that has infected our body politic. And what it means is that it becomes very difficult to suggest constructive things to do. Everything is about leaving Afghanistan, leaving Iraq, leaving Syria. It is in some ways the construct that Barack Obama shoved on us, which is that there is no middle ground between complete abdication of American leadership or 500,000 troops. Well, we can't do anything in Syria. You want to invade Syria? And this is the challenge for us. Tim mentioned the work that we've been doing on international institutions, and it is the inclination of the Trump administration to abandon lousy international organizations. Now, there are some that don't deserve American taxpayer dollars, and that's fine. I'm pretty good with being out of UNRWA, the United Nations Relief Works Agency that has been, educating and subsidizing terrorists for decades. On the other hand, there isn't another World Health Organization. So, what have we got? We've got a candidate for president who took us out, Donald Trump, and we've got a candidate who says he's going to bring us right back in again, Joe Biden. Neither of them are interested in figuring out how to reform this institution. And the place where you spent a lot of time, Mark, and where Tim and I worked for many years, Congress has just basically abdicated all responsibility. What used to be is that you used to leverage U.S. assistance programs and U.S. money and U.S. obligations to international agencies. And you used to say, hey, we want to give you the money. Here's what you've got to do for it. Right? And generally speaking, they listened because we're the largest donors. Instead of that, we're walking out. We don't want to be in that tent because you stink. This is not a world in which you can be effective. And I think that we go down a very dangerous road when we stay out of the fight, when we don't seek like-minded people who are on the other side of the aisle, because there are a lot of people who feel very uncomfortable with where the left has gone, with where the Quincy Institute is. We do have options, and we do have things to do, and we ought to fight harder.
So I've got one more question, and then I think we've got some questions from the audience that are coming in, but. When we think about one of the last great pandemics, there've been a couple since the so-called Spanish flu. But when you look at what was going on in the world in 1916, 1917, 1918, one of the reasons that the Soviet Union was possible was a very a war that went very badly for the Russian imperial order. I've got my Great Influenza book here that a lot of people have found to try to make sense of the COVID-19 pandemic. And one of the points in the book is that the Spanish flu would kill 7% of the entire population of Russia. And so a war that went badly, a pandemic that killed 7% of the Russian population, it made it pretty easy for the Bolsheviks to move in and establish a new order in Russia that ultimately would lead to the Cold War. And I guess the question that comes to mind is, when we think about what history teaches us about what happens during and after pandemics, when we think about why Americans should care about foreign policy with everything else that's going on, what do we think will come out of this pandemic and the instability it's brought to less stable regimes around the world? And so what do we think, these college kids and, Mark, your soon to be college student, my 6-year-old, what do we think the world is going to look like after this pandemic, for them? And how should we think about what that's going to mean for the United States when we think about what history teaches us about how pandemics have shaped the world in the past? So, Mark, I'll throw that easy question over to you first.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. Look, I think it painted a very depressing picture for all of you, so you can move to your next session with your, without any sense of optimism for the future. But let me actually talk about one ray of hope that, for me, I think has been both instructive and has given me some hope that we can actually take on our adversaries. And that is, I think the pandemic has revealed for Americans and for people around the world just how dangerous and pernicious and destructive the Chinese Communist Party is. I was looking at Pew Research polls before the session, and what was really interesting is to see the global views of China before the pandemic and after the pandemic. Before the pandemic, certainly in the United States, around the world, I think there was a view that we could economically seduce the hard men of Beijing to become responsible global stakeholders. That if we flood them with cash and integrate them into the global economy, if they become part of the WTO and if they're given deference in these international institutions, that we could moderate them, we could reform them. I think this is a school of thought that you've seen many administrations adopt. I mean, Barack Obama adopted this with the Iranians when he provided over $150 billion plus of economic relief in the hope that he could seduce Ali Khamenei to become a moderate. So I think both Republican and Democratic administrations thought they could do this with Vladimir Putin with every administration and its resets, only to discover that, when you look into the soul of Vladimir Putin, it's, what was it, John McCain who quipped that it was something like it was cold and dark, and it was black. And but that view that you could seduce the hard men of Beijing dominated thinking in the foreign policy establishment in Washington and around the world. And for the rest of the world, I think, China was something that just made a lot of good stuff and it was cheap and people were benefiting from it. The pandemic, I think, as Danny pointed out, the way the Chinese Communist Party suppressed the information, arrested doctors, Chinese doctors, who wanted to reveal the extent of this COVID-19 crisis. The way the Chinese have acted since then, the Pew Research polls show a dramatic drop in positive feelings with respect to China. Therein lies an opportunity. Therein lies an opportunity for smart policymakers, the kind of smart policymakers that Danny described and that I fear we may not have, at least not in 2021. We may have them again in 2024, 2025, when the new generation of Republicans and perhaps Democrats as well comes to the fore. But there is the opportunity to really take on the Chinese Communist Party and compete with them. And as Danny says, don't just walk away from the fight with international institutions, but go and compete, because the Chinese Communist Party is figured out a strategy to dominate these international institutions. And it's using its market power, its economic power, its military power, its disinformation power to really take on the United States and in many ways beat us at our game. We have that opportunity. But to capitalize on that opportunity, we can't keep infuriating our allies over every single issue. We got to choose the issue that really matters to us. What is it that really matters to us? I think it's taking on the Chinese Communist Party. That's got to be priority number one. Slightly below that, taking on the Islamic Republic and rallying our allies to focus on that as the priority. But if we get into fights with our allies for every single issue, then we're losing the political capital that we need. So the pandemic gives us an opportunity to take on the Chinese Communist Party, which is the preeminent strategic threat of our generation.
Danny, I'm going to ask you to be brief if I can. I want to get a couple of these questions from our audience in, but how do you see the issue in view of Mark's response?
Look, I think what Mark laid out in terms of the danger that we saw, that the analogies to the 1930s, the analogies to 1917, 1918 are rife. And the problem is that, as the 9/11 Commission said about the 9/11 attack, there is an absence, the problem for all of us is a lack of imagination. If you want to look at what the analogy is for how the world reordered itself after the Spanish flu pandemic, what you saw was the rise, obviously, the fall of Weimar Germany, the rise of the Soviet Union, and many, many other dangerous things, all of which we were too distracted, too troubled, and then too mired in the depression to manage. What could those things be now? We could see a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. I will tell you, I don't know what the United States is going to do. We're already seeing Russia interfering very aggressively, whether it's in Belarus or it's near abroad elsewhere. What would happen if Joe Biden is elected? We're going to see Iran with access to a lot more cash. Iran already governs Syria. They already govern Lebanon. They basically manage the Palestinians. They represent a very serious threat to a lot of our friends, our allies, and our partners. We could see them doing a whole series of other things that we can't begin to imagine. There are a whole world of crappy things that can happen. And the only thing I'll say about it is and I'll end with that so we can go to Q&A, is that while I am nervous about the next generation and really feel like we need to do our best to make an impression, to teach the things that haven't been taught over these Winston Churchill said it right. I come back to it all the time. We try everything else first, but in the end, we always do the right thing. And I just don't want the end to look as bad as it can look, and it has looked in the past.
So imagine a second term of Trump, a Biden administration. If you were to think about the three key priorities for a second term of Trump or a Biden administration, are they the same basic challenges but with different approaches, or do you see fundamentally different priorities between the two the two end states here? Mark?
In terms of foreign policy, I think both administrations will focus on China as the strategic threat that I described. I think both administrations will focus on Iran in completely different ways, as Danny has described. In my view, I think we run the risk actually with both of a lousy nuclear deal. I think in the case of Trump, that gets submitted to the Senate for advice and consent, and we have the Trump nuclear treaty, and then it's game over because now all those companies are going to be flooding back in. Even if Biden goes back into the Obama nuclear deal, we still have an opportunity to fight that deal as long as the Republican Party remains united. Iran, Middle East, I hope both presidents, whoever the president is, really capitalize on the tremendous normalization opportunities that are taking place between Israel and the Arab states. I think it's transformative for anybody who cares about a peaceful Middle East. And if you really want to withdraw U.S. troops from the Middle East, you better do that in an environment of stability and security and not continued crises.
I think a Biden administration would be in many, many ways a return to the status quo ante, and I think that's disastrous. When I worked in the Senate, my colleagues used to call the Democratic foreign policy making the world safe for cocktail parties. And so, lots and lots of the niceties that have been lost during the Trump administration would be restored. Our diplomats would be much happier. Our allies at NATO would be happier. There would be people in jobs, which are now sitting empty. And those would be great things. But that doesn't mean that all the institutions that have served us for the last 70 years are working. They're not. NATO is in a state of crisis. What are we supposed to do about Turkey? If we can't agree what to do inside NATO, how are we going to contend with Russia? If we can't persuade our allies in Europe not to adopt Huawei 5G, how are we going to stand together against China? So, I think while a Biden administration will focus on a lot of those atmospherics, making sure that the Brie and the Chardonnay is flowing, that won't fix the problems. I think a Trump administration will continue to be the ad hoc, fly by the seat of your pants challenge. And while I admire what the administration has done on China, I admire what they've done on Iran, I admire what they've done on Russia, I don't see a strategy for dealing with any of those going forward, except, as Mark said, to do a potentially terrible deal with Iran, which I worry about a great deal. But we actually need to contend with these things, and I'm not quite sure. I'm not quite sure either one of these candidates is willing to do any of that or has the ideas.
So this may be the last question, looking at the clock. But one thing that has gotten a little bit of interest here from the audience is the role of philanthropists. Philanthropists have played a big part in driving resources to economic recovery. When you think about other roles for philanthropists, you think about this education challenge we've all talked about. We think about charting the way forward for American foreign policy, taking on the China challenge, or helping to inform which path for American foreign policy engagement or isolation. What are some thoughts that you have for the group here on potential roles for philanthropists to chart the way forward when it comes to helping people to understand America's role in the world, whether they be, my 6-year-old, whether they be Mark's college student, Danny's college students, or for, frankly, policymakers in Washington?
Yeah, look, I think something that I learned coming to America 20 years ago is that, we have the most open system in the world where we have a constitutional right to petition our government. And what it does allow you to do is to affect change in ignore. We had this discussion yesterday on one of the panels, and the question was the State Department, Defense Department have a combined $60 billion budget, so what role do private philanthropists have to play? And of course, the response to that is that the entire American system, right, is built on the premise that private capital and private markets produce far better results than government bureaucracies. And that is why we have Silicon Valley and Route 128, and which is why we have, incredible startups, incredible prosperity. We have the ability to actually affect change through private action. And I would say through, the Hudson Institute, through AEI, where you guys work, through FDD, where I work, I think all three institutions have shown that you can actually turn ideas into action, and action into results. And we can do damage to the enemies of America through great ideas, credible research, turning those ideas into policy recommendations, and working Congress against the administration, working the administration against Congress, right? We've all been in that place, and understand that you can work the interagency itself against itself in order to get these ideas across the goal line. Private philanthropists can help finance that. They can demand return on investment from the groups that they do finance. And I think that's our job, is not to demonstrate activity in motion, but to demonstrate real measurable results defined as doing damage to the enemies of the United States. And that's our responsibility, and private capital can help facilitate that.
I think one thing that is really important to understand for people who are in national security, I'm not in a fund. We have three foundations that support us. When I do work with my friends at the Center for American Progress, they have dozens. Dozens. It is so much easier for the left to raise money. It's staggering. So if I wanted to say something to philanthropists, it is, Absolutely. You want people to deliver. You want scholars like, you want people like Mark. You want people like Ruel Garect, who's at FDD. You want people like Derek Scissors at AEI and Dale, executive branch and our Congress, about what China has been up to over the last 10 years than anybody else in this town. And we've seen real results, but they do most of their work without any financial backers. They do most of their work without any project support, except for the one that we get from a special few really consistent supporters. National security is very hard to raise support for, and I think that with more imagination, with the generosity of the people who have done so well in the free markets that still, thank God, exist in America up to a point, that there can be much, much more effective work done on education and on effective solutions for the United States.
So one last question, and this may have been a poor question to end with, but when you look back at America's about where we are with this moment in time, and you think back to where previous pandemics, you think about this remarkable partisanship we hear so much about. I sometimes ask myself, is this markedly different from the first Congress back in the late 18th century when we passed Alien and Sedition Acts? The same Congress that passed the First Amendment passed the Alien and Sedition Acts that essentially criminalized speech that the Federalist Party disagreed with. We fought a civil war. The late 60s with cities burning. Is this moment in time today truly unprecedented, or are there parallels that you could point to? More broad question.
I'll say this as an immigrant to America. I mean, I've been struck in the almost 20 years that I've been in the United States about how much Americans hate each other. It's really quite remarkable. I mean, I guess I grew up in polite Canada, where these debates are just not so vicious. The debates here are vicious.
They hate each other way more there.
Yeah, but it's interesting, Danny. I was going to get to this, so thank you for pointing that out. Right, the difference in Israel, I'm in Israel right now, is that everybody here, or most people here, have to serve in the military, right? And so, the poor kid from South Tel Aviv and the rich kid from Herzliya are in the same military unit. And in fact, the poor kid is probably the commanding officer. They serve together. They're in combat. I mean, Tim's a military veteran. He knows this. In the United States, 1% of the population serves in the military. They don't have the opportunity to meet each other. They don't have the opportunity to understand that, these differences don't have to be so vicious and caustic and vitriolic. So what I think is needed in America, and I've been a long time believer in this, is some program of national service. It doesn't mean military. It doesn't mean conscription. It doesn't mean getting rid of our all-volunteer professional army, which I think has obviously proven itself to be a very smart idea. But some program of national service where every 18-year-old spends 1 year before college doing something for the country. And I think it's important for that program of national service to give Americans the opportunity to meet each other. Because even in this time of COVID, I've seen the Israelis, right? You're right. They are always at each other's throats, but they come together in times of crisis and emergency. And unfortunately, they have too many times of crisis and emergency and wars and terrorism. But it makes a difference for them to have served together. We need to serve together and stop hating each other so much.
I love that. Amen. I agree. I think Americans need to talk to each other, and I think we need to, put a lot more effort in shining a spotlight on things that we agree about. Because there are so many things that we do agree about, civility and all that goes with it. National service would be a wonderful idea, and I agree with you. It doesn't have to be military. But with as Nick Eberstadt, who was our Crystal awardee yesterday, said, more than half of Americans now get something from the government, whether it's aid or it's education or it's healthcare or it's assistance, and it would be good to teach Americans that it's worth giving back.
Well, I want to thank Mark. Thank you very much, Danny. Thank you.